We're up to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a continuation of the discussion in chapter 4. Don't worry, we'll catch you up on what's important. But let's remember where we are in the general scheme of the Tanya. Chapters 1 introduced us to the two souls. Chapter 2 introduced us to specifically the godly soul and told us what it is, that it is a piece of God, and also told us the process by which that piece of God, of God's essence, comes down into this world. And then chapter 3 continued that and told us what does that godly soul feel, right? How it feels that connection, how it thinks that connection to God. And then chapter 4, which I'll go over the summary a little bit more in depth, chapter 4 spoke about how does the soul act on those emotions. The soul can feel or understand something about God, but what does it do about it? A soul is an abstract idea. The soul, it exists. It exists, but how does it experience, or how does it do something about those emotions or about that knowledge? And the answer is it has garments. The three garments of the soul are the thought, speech, and action, which when we're talking about the godly soul, that is when the godly soul inhabits these garments, the thought of Torah, the speech of either Torah or prayer, and the action of doing a mitzvah. That is how it embodies the ideas, and that's how it embodies the experiences and the feelings that it has towards God. And as we explained in depth in chapter 4. Chapter 5 continues along that theme. This is a bit of a shorter chapter, so we'll go through it a little bit slower, as well as this might be a little bit of a shorter class. The idea of chapter 5 is that not all connections are created equally. If we go back to chapter 4, we describe the experience of connecting to God. Right? How does a soul connect to God? How does anything connect to God? On one hand, we have God. God is infinite. God is great. God is, as soon as you say the word God is, you're already in trouble because you're already limiting God. You're defining God. God is really beyond all definitions, beyond all limits. We can't possibly comprehend. Then you have us.
How do you relate to infinity?
How do you relate to infinity? Even our soul, once it's in this world, is a human soul. It's very limited. It's very finite. How can you possibly bridge that gap? And as we explained at length last week, that God built a bridge. We couldn't do it. There's nothing we could do to bridge that divide, but God did. God embodied himself in the ideas of Torah, the knowledge and the wisdom of Torah, and in the ideas of the mitzvos. Those are godly. The action of doing a mitzvah is the action of touching God. And that has to be, of course, initiated by God. And as we described, that even when you're putting on your shoes in the right order, which as we said last week could be a mitzvah, doing it correctly, doing it according to Jewish law, is connecting to God. It might feel like that has no connection to God. It might feel like you're so far removed from God, but the truth is, it's like giving the king giving you a hug through a coat. Are you going to say, I didn't really get a hug because he was wearing too many layers? Of course not. We understand that although there are layers, there are coverings, it's not the king's essence, but we are, of course, getting the hug from the king itself.
Right and left? Right and left?
Put
on the shoes.
What? So the order of putting on shoes, just we mentioned this, I'll repeat. Morning. The order of putting on shoes is you put on the right shoe, then you put on the left shoe, and then if there are laces, you then do the left lace, and then the right lace. Because the Torah always prefers right over left, except specifically when it comes to tying. Tying, as we tie the tefillin on the left side, so we start off by tying the left shoe. Now, before we start into chapter 5, which chapter 5 is going to be discussing the benefits and the how the Torah study, how great Torah study is, I want to invoke something that we said last week, that everything in Torah, while you're learning about that thing, you'll be discovering how that's the greatest thing ever to exist. Right? We discussed about Jewish holidays. As you go through the calendar, when it's Rosh Hashanah's out of this world. It's the best, the most important day of the year. A week later, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the day. A couple weeks later, Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the essence of Judaism. Tu B'Shvat, Purim, every holiday, because of course when you're discussing a topic that is, you're discussing the merits of that topic, you're not necessarily comparing. And so, while of course there are tremendous merits in the hug that we get when we do a mitzvah. And as we discussed, how when you do a mitzvah with a physical item, that hug is reaching so down, so low, to the actual physical, you're taking a cow, and you're turning it into tefillin. When you wear that tefillin, the hug is coming down to the lowest levels and refining us in our lowest places. But, as we're going to see this week, there is another side to that hug. To the hug that we have when God hugs us when we do a mitzvah, there's another thing also. What about us hugging God? Right? A hug usually goes both ways, at least hopefully, if it's not an awkward hug. Right? What's the second half of that equation? How can we hug God? We understand how God hugs us. When we do a mitzvah, we are enveloped in that moment. That is God reaching across the divide and giving us a hug. However, there is another layer, another thing that can be accomplished, and that is when we learn Torah. And we are on page 101. This is the beginning of chapter 5. Uluteisvis bir, Bayer Hetiv Lashin Tefisa, Sha'amar Eliyahu, Leis Machshava Tfisa Bachchul. The previous chapter mentioned the words of Elijah the prophet. No thought can grasp you. Let's take this idea of grasping the divine further and clarify it well. So what Elijah, this is, we say it in the introductions, we're getting ready for Shabbos, so Mincha on Friday afternoon, we say this, it's Pasach Elio, it's a section where we discuss and very high Kabbalistic ideas. And as Elijah says, no one can grasp you, good morning, no thought can really grasp up. So what's the solution to that? Is that God had to initiate it because we can't grasp God. So the concept of, in general, grasping God, we're going to understand that in the idea, intellectually speaking. So, continuing on page 101, Hine.
It doesn't necessarily mean we know God because we can grasp God.
So that's what we're going to try to understand is grasping, right? We can't grasp God. God has to give us initiate and walk us through this idea that gives us the ability to quote unquote grasp God. What does that mean? That we can't grasp God on our own. God has to do it for us. Hine kol seichel shemaskil umasik b'sichli ezem muskel. Let's say your mind has formed a concept of an idea and gotten it straight. This means two things from two perspectives. There are two things going on when you understand something. Harei haseichel tefes es hamuskal umafikei b'sichlei. Your intellect now grasps the idea and mentally encompasses it. V'hamuskal nisvas umukaf umlubash b'seich haseichel shesigei v'haskilei. And from the other perspective, it means the idea is now grasped, encompassed, and enveloped within this mind of yours that has gotten it straight and formed the concept of it. When we understand something, there's of course two halves of that equation. We understand the idea, and that idea is now in our brain, which Gershon, is that your phone?
Oh, it's Moshe's phone.
Oh, it's Moshe's. That'll take a little bit.
Version.
Okay. So, when we understand something, right, the knowledge, we're going to be talking about two things. Learning, the action of learning something, and then what happens after you learn something, that knowledge is now in your brain. These days, and this is when we get to the area that I'm really not. Temporarily. Even we'll get to that in a second, because it's a good point you're bringing up. I'm not that I'm qualified to talk on this with any authority, and if anyone knows more and can articulate it better, please chime in. But now we know a little bit more about how the brain works, right? That what really is a piece of knowledge? What is a memory? What is something in our brain? There's a certain pathway that connects a certain idea. That this is sort of there's I don't even call it, a physical, but there is a manifestation of this knowledge within my brain. So while I'm learning it, I'm forming that pathway. I'm forming that neural network. Once I've learned it, and then as Len said, temporarily, right? Until I forget it, until it moves on, it's in my brain. But even once I forget it, you can't compare learning something for the first time and learning something for, even if I forgot it, it's really there. It's just maybe, hiding under some cobwebs. And so the idea of when we have a piece of knowledge, a piece of Torah knowledge within our brain, That is in our brain, whether physically, which we're not going to touch on that because I'm not qualified, but at the idea of right now my brain encompasses that idea. I have it. I grasp it. Right? It's within my grasp. I know this. I have this idea. Right? What do you say when you have a really cool idea? I got it. Right? It's mine. So that's one half. Now, there is also another part of learning Torah, which is the learning part, while I'm doing that action. This is page 102. The Gam. There's another dynamic as well. While you are actively grasping that idea and trying to get it straight in your mind is enveloped within the idea. And so this is the two-sided hug that we're talking about. Because the action of learning Torah is a mitzvah, just like any other mitzvah. While I'm putting on tefillin, my arm and my head, my skull, I don't want to say head, that can be confusing, is encompassed in that idea, is within that hug, that connection of God. But then what happens? After I take off my tefillin, once the Shabbos candles have long burnt out, is that hug still going on? So, no, the hug is over. The moment is gone. Now, there is, of course, a certain idea of refinement. There are many levels to what happens when we do a mitzvah. And a big part of doing a mitzvah is that now our bodies, our physical bodies, are more refined. The arm, before it puts on tefillin, is a little more coarse. After, it's a little more refined. The world, before Shabbos candles are lit, is a little dimmer. Now the whole world is a little brighter. But that I would compare, if anyone's ever done woodworking, right? So you can sand a piece to make it smooth. Once you take away the sandpaper, there's no memory of the effect. You can still see the effect of the sandpaper, that now it's smooth, but the sandpaper is no longer there. The moment is gone. The hug is no longer currently happening. That's also true when we talk about learning Torah. While I'm learning, right, we're sitting, we are acquiring new knowledge. Our brains are right now encompassed within that hug from God. We're experiencing that moment, that connection. But the difference of acquiring knowledge is that once you have it, it's always within you. Now that knowledge is part of who you are. We're going to walk away from this class not the same person we walked in, not just because we're a little more refined. And again, I don't want to diminish the effect that mitzvos and the light, but that's not our topic today. And that's sort of the two, when we're talking about Torah, I don't want to put down mitzvos, but we're talking about the greatness of Torah study. I walk away from learning Torah a better person, a different person, because now there is a piece of Torah knowledge within me. And we'll discuss what that means, right? Because Torah knowledge is not just like another science or another cool fact. Torah knowledge is so much more. And therefore, when we leave, when we're no longer actively learning Torah, we still have that knowledge within us. There's a fascinating Jewish law that when a Torah scholar, someone who's visibly a Torah scholar, someone who makes their life about Torah, when they walk into a room, we rise in respect, right? Because because they're a Torah scholar. Now, even if they're not actively learning Torah, we still rise in the merit and the honor of their Torah. We rise. Now, if someone, let's say not specifically a Torah scholar, if they're in the middle of doing a mitzvah, we rise for them as well. If you see someone walking in, I should have done it just now, but when Moshe walked in wearing tefillin, we should have stood up in honor of the mitzvah that he's doing, in that out of reverence and respect. What if someone who's not actively doing a mitzvah and is not specifically a Torah scholar, do you still rise up? No, right? Because at that moment there's nothing special about them. But why is it that someone can do a lot of mitzvos, but if not actively doing a mitzvah, we don't rise in respect? Someone can learn a lot of Torah, and if they're not actively learning Torah, we still rise up when they walk into a room. What's the difference? Because Torah becomes part of you. You are all of the Torah that you've learned. Within your brain, within your mind, there is all of that knowledge, and it is part of who you are. And that is the greatness. That's and he would say the maila, the advantage of learning Torah. That as opposed to doing the mitzvos, where while you're doing it, you're experiencing this incredible connection that we spoke about last week. But once it's done, you're a little more refined, but you are no longer the tefillin. The tefillin or the Shabbos candles are no longer part of you. Different, however, is learning Torah. That even when you're no longer actively learning, that knowledge is still within you. And still part of who you are.
And repetition is the key to learning.
Absolutely, right? Because the idea of learning Torah, forming those pathways, forming those neural networks, if you learn it once, you're asking to forget. You're asking that it's just very, very temporary. We're supposed to learn again and again. And as the Talmud describes the level of diligence that's required for Torah study, we're going to reference that a little bit later in the Tanya as well, how in the olden days, before these days, we're very lazy. We have printed books. So in my mind, I don't even know everything by heart. If I ever have a question, I know exactly which, I'm an index. I'm not a knowledge base, right? The difference between an index and a knowledge base is I know where to look. I don't know everything. In the olden days, they didn't have printed books, and you couldn't always assume that you'll have access to a library. And so they would learn everything by heart. And the Talmud tells us that regular students, your average person, would study something 100 times to get it perfectly. So for the next 100 weeks, we're going to be studying the same.
101.
So that's what we're going to discuss over the next, probably in a month or so, about the difference of learning at time 101. The difference between time 50 and 100 is not as big as the difference between 100 and 101. And I'll leave that as a cliffhanger that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. But for our discussion here, there are two steps that happen. There is the mitzvah like any other mitzvah while I'm learning Torah, while I'm acquiring that knowledge. It's like any other mitzvah. My mind is encompassed, is swimming in the pool of Torah knowledge. But then there's the after. What happens then? Now I have that knowledge within my mind. It's mine, it's acquired, it's permanently part of who I am. As we continue on page 102, Derech Mashal, K'sha'adam mevin u'masig eza halacha b'mishnah e b'gemara la'ashuya abuyer hine sichloi teifus u'makiv oisei. For example, you've understood some halacha of the Mishnah or the Talmud, and you've got it thorough and clear. Your mind now grasps that halacha, encompassing it. I mean, that piece of knowledge, that halacha, that tidbit of information is now within your mind. V'gam sichlei melubash ba ba'isha. And as well, at the time you were pondering this halacha, your mind was enveloped within it. You could see on page 103 those two sides of that coin. That while you're learning it, you're like swimming in it. But then when you're done, it's within you. You drink of the water, and it is within you. Continuing on page 104, and I will shout out that the footnotes, a lot of them go off on tangents that I'm not going to. I don't want to distract us too much from our main point. But definitely a fascinating read. All of the footnotes and ideas that are brought down in the shaded boxes on the bottom. But we're going to continue on page 104. That's true about really any knowledge, right? If you're learning math, the first time you learned 1 + 1 = 2, you were then in that knowledge, and now that's part of you, right? Someone who knows the timetables can always pull it up at a moment's notice because it's always within them. It's part of their knowledge base. It's part of who they are. But we're not talking about random knowledge here. Again, referencing back what we discussed last week. What is Torah? Torah is God. And therefore, on page 104, Hine halacha zu hi chachmasei v'ratzonei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now this halacha is God's essential wisdom and will, which I will just reference again. By us, our wisdom and will is different from who we are. By God, that's not the case. God's wisdom, hu v'chachmasei echad, God and His wisdom are one. And therefore, what is God's wisdom? Now, again, it's kind of weird for us to imagine this. Because if you actually open up a Torah book, if you open up a Chassidus book or a Kabbalah book, I can understand how that's God's will and wisdom, that's a piece of God. But if you open up a code of Jewish law, you open up a Mishnah, what are you going to find? Continuing on page 104. Sha'ala b'ritzonei kishiyitayin ruven kach v'kach derech mashal v'shimon kach v'kach yehapsach b'neim kach v'kach. God desires that if Reuven presents a certain argument, for example, and Shimon puts forth another, the final ruling between them will be such and such. And again, as you know, even if one of them are lying, that idea, this entire conversation, is part of God's will and wisdom. And therefore, if in my brain I have, American law, all right, cool. It's a random fact. But if I have Jewish law, which Jewish law is not what some people got together and decided. Jewish law is the will and wisdom of God. What do I now have within me? A piece of God. And wherever I go, no matter what I'm doing, no matter what's happening, that piece of God is within me. It is permanently part of who I am. And just to continue this idea of this knowledge could be so abstract and so seemingly minor, it could be something that never even happened. There are certain laws that are pretty far-fetched, and in fact, the Talmud tells us these stories never happened. I don't know any examples of
the destruction of, or bringing a child.
Exactly. Those are the two examples I was going to mention. Exactly right. There are two major laws that are pretty harsh. One is there's a certain story of a child who is very much inevitable that they're going to go off the path. And not only going to go off the path, that they're going to end up as a destructive and horrible human being. The law is that that teenager is put to death. Completely harsh, and it's a really harsh story. The Talmud tells us the limitations, the exact sequence of events are so specific, the story never actually happened.
But the threat
is there, yes, exactly. Morning. The threat, right? So too, there's a certain thing about if an entire city has been taken over by idol worship, the entire city and everything inside is completely destroyed. But again, the sequence and the exact story is so specific, it never actually happened. So if I'm learning those hypothetical laws, is that really God's wisdom? Of course it is. God's wisdom, God's desires, God's Torah encompasses all of these. From the most minor court cases that, are one person is lying and it's seemingly so trivial, as well as the most abstract stories that never happened and never will happen, all of these are God's desires. As we continue on page 104, Af im loy haya v'layiyah hadavar hazel la'elam love lemishpat al tainus tviyas elu. And even if such a case with these particular claims and demands never came to judgment and never will. There's the Rabbi instituted a custom of learning pieces of Rambam, Maimonides, who wrote a Torah, a book of Jewish law. So one of the things about what sets Maimonides apart from other codes of Jewish law is that it's every single part of Jewish law. These days, if you open up any Shulchan Aruch, a lot of laws are missing because a Shulchan Aruch written in the 1500s is not going to include laws about the Holy Temple. It's not going to include most laws about purity and impurity because those are just not relevant topics, and so there's no reason to include them. Maimonides has the entire Torah, every law is included in Maimonides. And that's one of the reasons why the Rabbi instituted it. So these days we're learning the laws of purity and impurity. And some of these are the most hypothetical, abstract, about someone's in a box and the box flies over a field that has an impurity and it goes back. These laws that don't actually, can never happen, never will happen. What's the idea? Why do we learn them? Because of what we're discussing here. These are still God's wisdom and desire. Yes, there are parts of Judaism that we learn, parts of Torah we learn to tell us what to do. There are parts of Torah that are instruction books for us. How do you put on tefillin? How do you light Shabbos candles? How do you live life as a Jewish person? That's the code of Jewish law. These days there's a Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, the summary of Jewish law, which is a great resource to just know how to live as a Jew. But that's not the end-all and be-all of Torah. Torah is also God's wisdom. And equal to the importance and to the level of God's wisdom as the laws of tefillin are, also the laws of impurity, the laws of temple sacrifices that haven't been relevant in 2,000 years, unfortunately. All of those, mikol mokem me'acher shekach Allah, b'rtzonei v'chachmasei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, she'im yiteh kach v'kach, so yitin zeh kach, yeh psach kach. Nevertheless, what matters is that this is God's will and wisdom. If one person would argue like this and another would argue like this will be the ruling. That being so, when you know this halachic ruling and you understand it, as it is set out in the Mishnah of the Talmud or the later halachic adjudicators, your mind comprehends, grasps, and encompasses God's desire and wisdom. When you know the most simple of Jewish law, you're accomplishing the impossible. Something that even Elijah said is impossible. Elijah said we can't grasp God, and we can't. What can we do? We can learn Torah. And when we learn Torah, not only are we experiencing godliness, not only are we connecting to godliness while we're actively learning, but now that became part of who we are, and our mind permanently encompasses that idea. Continuing on page 105, the leis machshavat tfisabe v'leibur tzoni v'chachmasek hi'im behislapshus ba'alachas aruchas lefenenu. You are grasping God, who cannot be grasped by any thought, and neither can His will or His wisdom. Yet, clothed in these halachas that have been made accessible to us, you do grasp them, His wisdom, His will, and Him Himself.
So you can't truly come to God without Torah? I mean, people that say, I'm not religious, but I know God and I feel God in my heart, but they're not actually doing the law because they haven't learned what they have to do.
So I'll take your points one at a time. Because first of all, as we mentioned last week, when someone says, there's really two minuses. Someone says that I'm just spiritual. Number one is that they're not actually making that connection. And this is really, being a spiritual person really means you're limited by your ability to comprehend and relate to spirituality. You're limited by your humanity. When we do a mitzvah, or when we learn Torah as we're discussing this week, you're accomplishing so much more. If it was an either or, either I could be a spiritual person or I could be doing mitzvos. Which one is more important? Mitzvos, 1,000%. Now, we're supposed to have both. And as we discussed and as we will discuss, having both is what builds this building, and having the love and the fear and the connection and the comprehension about God, not understanding what God is, but understanding about God, that is what gives our mitzvos life. You could do a mitzvah once or twice, but if you don't really understand and connect to God, you're not going to do it. You're not going to make a part of your life if you don't have that connection and that spirituality. But that's the cause, but you need to have the effect. And so when someone says, I'm a spiritual person, but I don't act on it, I connect to God my own way, well, you're limiting your connection to God by you, because you're connecting to God your own way. That's nothing compared to what we can actually accomplish when we connect to God on God's terms. Because, if you imagine you have to climb up to a 100th floor of a building, if someone on the top throws down a rope, you're connected. You hook on, and they'll drag you up. But if you have to put up a ladder, your measly 20-foot ladder isn't going to get you very far. And that's the difference of connecting to God by our own terms or by connecting to God the way God. Now, within that connection, that rope that God throws down, there's the mitzvah aspect. There's the fact that every action that we do that's a mitzvah connects us to God in a way that we can't do on our own. But now we're taking that a step further, that when we have Torah knowledge, not only is it, while we're learning it, we're accomplishing the mitzvah of learning Torah, but we are also internalizing and making part of ourselves a piece of God in a way that even mitzvos doesn't usually accomplish. On page 106, V'gam sichle melubash bam, and as you are learning, your mind is immersed within them. This union, this connection that we have while we're learning Torah, that it's not just a one-sided hug that God is hugging us, but we're hugging back, we're grasping a piece of God within us. As the Alter Rebbe continues, V'hu yichud nifla she'ein yichud kamayhu. V'lei ke'erkei nimsa klal bagashmis liyus la'achadim u'miyuchadim mamish l'chol tzadapina. This is an amazing union. There is nothing like it or even approaching it among physical things. Nothing at all. You grasp Torah and your mind and God become an absolute singular oneness from every angle and in any way. To really, this ability to have infinite and finite in one package, mixed together and just one fused into one new entity does not exist. Even if you dissolve salt in salt water, right? So now you have salt and water, now it's salt water. It seems like it's completely one entity. Can you take them apart? Of course you could. You boil the water disappears and the salt remains. In the physical world, we don't have this idea of a bond and a union, that two separate things, especially finite and infinite, which on their own couldn't possibly connect. We have a secret ability to fuse them as one. And then suddenly it's not two ideas that are connected. It's not two ideas that are now intertwined. They are one new entity, a person that encompasses God within him. And now, as we say, this is the discussion about the merits and the additional benefits and what makes Torah learning best, right? And that's just not me saying that. That is what as we'll quote later from the Mishnah. Me as someone who a big part of my responsibilities here in Northern Nevada is Torah study. This is a very important chapter to me, because when we're talking about Torah knowledge, not to take away from mitzvah performance, but Torah knowledge accomplishes something so much deeper. Continuing on page 106, V'zois ma'ila yisera gedela v'nifla le'ein kates asher b'mitzvahs yediyas atera v'hasagasa al kol mitzvahs masiyos v'afilo al mitzvahs hatluyos b'dibur v'afilo al mitzvahs v'talmud Torah sheb'dibur. This is an enormous, amazing quality of the mitzvah of knowing Torah and understanding it that places it immeasurably beyond all action mitzvahs. Indeed, even immeasurably beyond those mitzvahs you do by speaking, and even immeasurably beyond the mitzvah of learning Torah out loud. We discussed last week that specifically when you're learning Torah, you're supposed to learn it out loud. Why? Because you're involving more garments. You're involving not only your intellect, but also your power of speech. But the most important part of that, the most potent part of that is still going to be the intellect, because that's what accomplishes this union. Speaking, when you speak, at the time when your lips are moving, you're accomplishing something, and you're making that connection. The minute your lips stop moving, that connection is gone. You're no longer actively learning Torah, and as we'll see, the garments, of thought, speech, and action, garments are very easily changed. That's one thing that the limits of the garments that we have is that in one moment you could be embodying the garments of the godly soul, your mind could be thinking Torah, then you get distracted or someone walks in you don't like, and immediately your mind switches to being a garment for the animal soul because now it's thinking hateful thoughts about someone else. That's the thing about a garment. That isn't who you are. And as easily as you can change your shirt, you can change a garment. But here we're not talking about the garments. We're talking about what changes within you. You are, no matter what you're thinking, no matter what negative or horrible thoughts you're currently thinking, your brain is still a brain that has Torah knowledge within it. And that is the difference that Torah study makes. As the Alter Rebbe explains on page 107, Ki al yidei kol ha-mitzvahs shebedibur ubamaisa HaKadosh Baruch Hu malbish es ha-nefesh umakifa Hashem mireish v'ad ragla. Because when you perform a mitzvah by speaking or doing, God surrounds your soul like a garment, and His light encompasses her from head to foot. Ubiyediyas atera milvad shehasteichel melubosh b'chachmas Hashem, hine gam chachmas Hashem b'kirbay. But when you acquire Torah knowledge, not only is your mind enveloped within God's wisdom, but God's wisdom is also integrated within you. Continuing on page 108, Masha haseichel masig b'teifis umakif b'sichlei, Masha efshlei litfis al-hasig umiyadiyas atera ish kifi sichlei v'koich idiyasei v'asagase b'pshat yeremesh yosed. It's within you, in the form of the Torah, that your mind comprehends, grasps, and encompasses, according to your mind's ability to grasp it with your particular way of thinking, your capacity for knowledge, and your level of comprehension in the four realms of the Torah's orchard, which is sort of the four general layers of the literal meaning, the more abstract meaning, the hints, and the secret meaning. What happens when we learn Torah is not only are we learning a piece of knowledge, but you're the only person who truly understands it in your particular way. Right? Everyone, that's always, they say that the reason why reading a book is better than watching a movie. Because reading a book, it's your mind is making the story. Your mind, when you're watching a movie, you're limited by the director's vision. And you're limited, you'll see the sights the way the director sees them, and you can't, your mind is limited because you see it in front of you. But when you read something, your imagination, you're the only person that truly imagines that book that millions of people have read. You're the only person that read it your way. And the same is true with Torah knowledge. Right? And it's funny, because last week we spoke about this as sort of, sort of a negative, that you're limited by your own ability. But you're also embodying it as yourself. You are the only person that really connects with Torah in this exact way, with this exact limits of knowledge, with this exact twist. It's all you. And that union, that connection that you build with the Torah that you learn, so while you're learning it, God is hugging you. And when you're done, you're hugging God. And that hug never ends. Because that knowledge is always within you, within your psyche, within who you are, there is a literal piece of God. And, we spoke about that being the soul. But now we're talking about how even, we're not talking about what you are as a limited human, but within your limited humanity, and specifically because of your limited humanity and exactly how you understand Torah, you have a personal piece of godliness, of not only godliness, of God Himself within you. You're hugging God back, and that is the grasping that you could do on the Torah.
So when you say study Torah,
yes,
are you talking about reading the Chumash? Are you talking about reading commentaries? I mean,
All of the above.
so it's never ending.
Absolutely. And I mean, the idea of learning Torah is specifically never ending because it's God, and God is never ending. And that it really goes to, the what we're not discussing in here, but another one of the things that Torah study has that mitzvos don't really have is most mitzvos are limited by time and place. Not all of them, but most of them are. So if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I already said the evening Shema, what mitzvah can I do right now? So some mitzvahs I'm automatically doing, right? I'm already wearing my yarmulke, my tzitzis. But what Torah study is eternal. Because Torah study has a little bit more of that infinity, and that's why, while you can only put on tefillin once a day, you can only light Shabbos candles once a week, Torah is limitless. And Torah never ends, and we will add to Torah. You're absolutely right. Now, when, to your question that you asked itself about Torah, what part of Torah? Any part of it. But here we're specifically talking about acquiring knowledge. Whether that knowledge is reading the words of the Chumash, and now I know those words, or it's talking about the most intense Talmudic debates, or the most high abstract Kabbalistical concepts, all of those have this same idea. That now when I walk away from that study session, this is very meta, but all of us are going to walk away from this class with a new knowledge and appreciation for the connection with God that we build through studying Torah. That knowledge itself is part of that equation. This is Torah. We're learning about God, we're learning about us, we're learning about how Torah works. And so all of us are going to walk away from this class with that knowledge. And in 20 minutes or an hour or in 20 months, whenever it is, when we're no longer thinking about it actively, is that knowledge still there? It is. I might be a little rusty, it might not be instant recall, but that knowledge is part of who we are. And there's a fascinating Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, in Ethics of Our Fathers, that says that if you forget the Torah study, it's the most horrible thing in the world. Someone who forgets their Torah study, and as the commentaries explain, we're not just talking about someone who didn't study enough so they forgot. Someone who actively neglects their Torah study to make themselves forget, they're liable for the death penalty. Now we can understand a little bit why. When we understand what does it mean to have Torah knowledge within us, not besides for learning Torah and that idea, but to have that knowledge within us is walking around with God. And obviously, the more Torah we know, the more percentage of our psyche is Torah knowledge, and the better off we are. But even just one Torah fact, another thing from Ethics of Our Fathers, which we could hopefully understand a little bit more from this conversation. If you learned one Torah fact from someone, you have to respect them. And the Torah brings the Ethics of Our Fathers, the Mishnah brings the example of David, King David, author of the Psalms, a tremendous Torah scholar. He was such a Torah scholar that he couldn't even, the angel of death couldn't take him because he was learning Torah so much. He learned 2 laws from someone, 2 minor detail laws from a person, and for the rest of his life he called that person my master, my teacher. Now we can understand a little bit more. Because when someone teaches you, if I teach you guys 1 + 1 = 2, which by the way it is, last I checked, but did I change your life? Okay, you have cool knowledge, and maybe now you'll continue to build your math knowledge on that. But with Torah knowledge, the smallest fact, if someone tells you the smallest Torah fact, part of your psyche is a piece of God that person taught you, that person gave to you. And so of course we can understand why, no matter who that person is, no matter how much greater and smarter I am, but the fact is, part of me, permanently part of me, is a piece of God that person helped me acquire. And so I owe them one.
You have to quote his name when you...
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And another part of Ethical Father, we always quote who we learn things from. We always go back and say, as we know from the Purim story, the importance of always quoting. And because we can understand now that Torah knowledge is not a simple thing. It's not even just the action of doing a mitzvah while we're studying Torah, but the ability that we have to retain Torah knowledge, retain a piece of God within us, is, as you just said, the most incredible connection and union that we have from God. Now, there is one physical idea that we can relate this to, and sort of part of our life that we can experience, and I'm going to use the example of it's really the Tanya's example that I'm going to build on. What's the difference between eating food and chewing gum? Not that I endorse chewing gum or that I chew gum, but the idea of chewing gum. What happens? Hopefully you spit it out. So the minute you're done, maybe your breath is a little mintier, or maybe you're feeling a little refreshed, but did your body change? Did you change because of the gum that you consume? These days, gum is 50% sugar anyway, so it's a very different conversation. But the idea of chewing gum, I'd say the same thing for smoking, but smoking we know these days definitely does make a difference in our body, and so that's not a good example. But once you're done chewing, while you're chewing, you don't know if the guy's eating. If he's chewing, you don't know what's going on. But as soon as you're done, you're done. What happens when we consume food? That food becomes part of who we are. It becomes our fuel. It becomes, the next action that I do has a little bit of challah in it. It has a little bit of, because it's part of who I am. Not to the same extent as Torah becomes who I am, because, of course, anyone who knows, I'm sure Len has a lot to tell us here about what happens in our body, consumes food, and it becomes part, how all that works. But the idea of that it becomes part of you, becomes part of your body. It becomes your blood cells, it becomes your fat cells, your muscle cells, all of those, they were once food. That is a similar idea to what we're discussing here. Continuing on page 110. Ulefi shebiydias hatera milubeshes benefesh ha'adam v'sichle u'mekefes b'seichem v'lechein nikra b'shem lechem u'mazein ha'nefesh. So, since knowing Torah means that Torah is invested within your soul and mind and encompassed by them, therefore Torah is called bread and nourishment for the soul. Ki kemoish halechem hagashmi zan es haguf kishe machnisai b'seichei b'kirvei mamish v'nepach sham lihes dam uvasar kipsarei aza yichya v'yaskayim. Just like physical bread, you consume it, actually integrating it within yourself to nourish your body. It's metabolized to become your own blood and flesh, and now you live off its energy. Kach b'dias hatera v'hasaga b'nefesh ha'adam kishalem dehetiv be'iyun b'sichle ad shenitfeses b'seichel mishechedes imay v'hayla achadim. The same occurs when your soul consumes knowledge and comprehension of Torah. You learn it well, you study it until it becomes embedded in your mind, until it becomes part of you. You and this Torah you are learning become one. Ne'asa mazain lenefesh v'chayim b'kirba mechayi hachayim v'ein seif baruchu mulubeshes b'chachmasi v'tzirasi sheb'kirba. This becomes nourishment for your soul. Your soul has life within her from the one who gives it all life, the infinite God. He is there clothed within his wisdom and his Torah that are now integrated within your soul. What is our soul's life force? Our body is powered by food. What powers our soul? Its connection to God. Its desire and its yearning and its ability to connect to God is what powers the soul. And therefore, by feeding it Torah, by having that now it has Torah knowledge within it, it has that connection, that unity built in. And you just installed another battery pack within your soul that powers it and gives it strength for the battles that lay ahead, as we're going to continue to discuss in chapter 6 and on. But for right now, we have a new understanding of the relationship between the soul and God. And we're going to, we'll finish off the last idea of this chapter, and then we'll summarize what we know about the godly soul. This idea of Torah as nourishment, as it's not just a garment. Right? Till now we discussed Torah and mitzvos as a garment. It's one of the ways these are the ways that the soul expresses its feelings or its appreciation or its knowledge of God. But now we're saying Torah knowledge is so much deeper. Torah knowledge is like the food. It becomes one with the soul. We'll understand a little bit about what happens in the world to come. So, as we explained, after we're done with this world, after the soul is limited, and we're talking about specifically after death. I'm not talking about the world to come as in the time of Mashiach. That's a different calibration, it's a different story. But right now, what happens when the soul is no longer limited by the body? It goes upstairs to get its reward. Maybe there's a little bit of a cleanup that has to happen first, a couple cycles in the washing machine. But once it's done with that, it's time to get its reward. So as we said last week, how does the soul relate to godliness? Well, it's been working, refining itself. It has the garments that it has been working on. It has the garments that it made in this world, the Torah and mitzvahs. But if we want to get a little bit continuing the parable we brought last week of that, you work hard in wherever you live, and then it's time to go on vacation. And so you go and you find a nice beach somewhere, and that's where you sit, and that you just sit back and enjoy the sights, the smells, and the sun of the beach that you found. That is really what the soul is doing. The soul worked hard in this world. It went through everything that it has to do in this world. It racked up the mileage. It racked up the airline points and the hotel points. And now it's ready to enjoy its vacation. It's ready to enjoy its reward. So as we discussed last week, the way that the soul can relate to that depends on what it did. That's the sunglasses and the comfortable, relaxing clothes that we're talking about. But that's the Torah and mitzvos. That's the mitzvos specifically.
And it's limited, right? It can't do
100%.
Once it's out of the body.
Yeah, we referenced that last week, that you can only acquire more in this world. And so the next world, once the Torah, right? Because in this world, we have the opportunity to connect to God, whether it's mitzvos or Torah. We have the ability to connect to the infinite. Once we're in the next world, it's limited by what the soul can relate to and what the soul has done. But what the soul has done, what the soul brings with it, in addition to bringing with a good bathing suit and a good pair of sunglasses and a floppy hat, the soul also has to bring along food. The soul also has to bring along nourishment. And that nourishment is a Torah knowledge that it acquired in this world. Inside on page 111, this is the meaning of the verse, your Torah is within my bowels. As it is written in Eitz Chaim, Portal 44, Chapter 3. The clothing of the soul in the heavenly Garden of Eden are the mitzvahs performed in this world. V'haTorah hi hamazen laneshames sha'askei ba'olam hazeh v'haTorah lishma k'may shekasav v'zayhar v'yakol daf reshut. But their nourishment is the Torah they learned in this world, provided that these souls engage in Torah for its own sake, as written in Zohar, Parshat Vayakol, Volume 210. What does it mean, Torah for its own sake? Because unfortunately, you can have many people who learn Torah, but it doesn't serve as a connection to God, because you're not learning it as you're not using it as you're not learning it as a connection to God. Therefore, the knowledge that's within you is tainted. It's not proper, pure, divine knowledge. It's, I want to get smarter, or I want to win a Twitter argument, and therefore I have this knowledge within me. So this is sort of a one caveat that he's throwing in here, that yes, learning Torah has a tremendous power, but it has to be learning it for the right reasons. As he continues, V'lishma.
Learning for the wrong reasons is still learning.
So yes.
And then maybe in the future.
That's great, because that divides the two parts of. Let me finish the next paragraph, and then I'll go back to what you said. In this context, learning Torah for its own sake means studying it to connect your soul with God by grasping it with your particular intellect, as explained in Eitz Chaim. Then the Torah becomes spiritual food for your soul in the heavenly Garden of Eden. Glenn brings up a really good point. What if I learn Torah for the wrong reasons?
You want to impress people.
I want to impress people. So, going back to the ethics of our fathers, it's better to start off for the wrong reasons, because you'll eventually get to the right reasons. Now, there is part of me that wants to really be, judge everyone favorably and say, even when it's for the wrong reasons, you want to impress people with your Torah knowledge. Even there is something spiritual, something holy, something connecting there. But even someone who's learning for the complete wrong reasons, at the moment they're learning, are they doing a mitzvah of learning Torah? As long as it's not for bad reasons. Bad reasons is completely wrong. But if someone's learning for selfish reasons, I'm putting on tefillin because I want the Chabad rabbi to get off my back. Did I do the mitzvah of tefillin? Absolutely. Did it refine me? Is there that lasting effect? Maybe. But Torah knowledge, the knowledge that's within me, he's saying here, it has to be with pure intentions. It has to be the battery pack that I'm installing, the food that I'm eating. If it's tainted, it can be a pretty big issue. And so here again, you see that divide between the action of the mitzvah, which you have by Torah learning as well, which is I'm sitting and I'm acquiring new knowledge. That is an action. That's something I'm involved in. Right reasons, wrong reasons, medium reasons, whatever. But here he's saying, if I want that to fuel me, it has to be healthy food. It has to be nourishing food. It has to be done for the right reasons. And now
Isn't there a saying you can be a bastard with the permission of the Torah?
Yeah, I mean that's a similar point as well. It is brought down further in the footnote, and so I don't want to go too what's it called in it. But there is absolutely the idea that when we learn Torah for the wrong reasons, it's a problem. And learning Torah for the wrong reasons is, in fact, a sin. Now, how does that jive? It's complicated, and right reasons and wrong reasons are relative, and depends what we're doing and how we're doing it. But to really show you the other side of that coin, which is brought in further at the bottom of page 11 in that footnote, there is a saying that because the Jewish people did not say the blessing before they learned Torah, that's why they were punished. What do you mean? They learned Torah, they did the right thing. They didn't say a blessing and suddenly they were punished? So there is, of course, a literal blessing that we're all supposed to say in the morning as part of our morning blessings, thanking God for giving us the Torah. But we explain, the commentator explained, what does it mean they didn't say the blessing for the Torah? They didn't acknowledge that this was divine wisdom. They were learning it like any other subject. And ultimately, that's a problem, because Torah is so much more than that. And for now, we'll leave it at that, and I'll let you read further in the footnote about this idea. Because I don't want to say it's bad, and someone who's learning Torah for the wrong reasons should stop learning Torah, but it definitely is problematic. Finally, at the end of chapter 5, there's a bracket, and this is a sort of a parenthetical idea, that a reminder that there's two parts, basically summarizing and sort of reiterating that there are two parts of learning Torah, that there is the nourishment angle of Torah that we just discussed, but there is also the clothing aspect of Torah, which still exists. And this is on page 112. When we say that the Torah is nourishment for the soul, we mean it as an inner sort of light that your soul can observe. When we say that the mitzvah are clothing for the soul, we mean they provide an encompassing sort of light beyond anything that can be absorbed and internalized. Which, by the way, again, while you're discussing one topic, you talk about the greatness of that idea. There is also the idea that mitzvos are beyond being, the reason why we can't absorb mitzvos is because they're beyond our ability to absorb. Again, two sides of the coin, that yes, it's better because we do absorb it and it becomes part of us, but that also means by definition that it's not as all-encompassing and great as some other lights, which is part of a broader discussion. With this, we can explain why our rabbi said that Torah study outweighs all the other mitzvahs combined. Because mitzvahs provide clothing alone. Torah, however, is at once both nourishment and clothing for your divine thinking soul. Even though Torah is an inner sort of light, nevertheless, when your soul is engrossed in studying Torah and learning more of it, she's clothed herself within it. All the more so when you speak out loud whatever you're learning, then the breath of your speech becomes an kind of all-encompassing light, as it said in previous time. Here he's saying that Torah study has both. Why is Torah equal to all other mitzvos? Because all other mitzvos are only clothing. They only form that external idea, that external connection. Torah has both. Torah is both the action of learning Torah, which forms clothing, especially when you articulate the words. That very breath becomes light, becomes a mitzvah, becomes a connection. But it also has that internal light. Now, before anyone would say, all right, well, now I know the secret of Judaism. I don't need to do anything. I just need to learn everything. Right? I don't need to do, right? I have both the internal and the external by learning Torah. Who needs any of the other 612 mitzvahs? To that, I'll reiterate what we said last week, which is that every part of our soul is divided into 613 parts. Just like our body, the Torah describes as being divided up into 613 different limbs and sinews and vessels and etc. Again, we're not going to count them, but that's the idea brought down in Torah. So too our soul is as well. And so there is part of our soul that needs the mitzvah of tefillin or needs the mitzvah of Shabbos candles in order to form that bond. And while, yes, if you learn Torah all day, you're forming incredible bonds, but you're limited with the Torah study part of your soul, which discussing parts of souls and different limit, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this class. But the idea is that our soul needs all mitzvahs to form a real connection. Yes, you can strengthen one strand of that connection by learning Torah, and you have internal and external, everything is great, but there are 612 other strands that are not being strengthened and not being acted upon, and that's a problem. Of course, that leads to the question of if someone, these days we're limited in what mitzvahs we do, and men versus women, there's so many limits to that, and how do we have all this? That's a bit of a longer discussion, either by learning them or by the idea that our souls in previous lives have done other mitzvot. So when my soul was reincarnated years and years ago by someone who lived in the temple time, they built the strands of sacrifices and purity and all of those that I can't build myself. Again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of our discussion, but don't worry. You're not limited by we're not at a disadvantage because of what we can and cannot do, but we are definitely need to maximize what we work on. The end of chapter 5 is really an end of an idea that we're discussing in Tanya. Because chapter 2, 3, and 4, and 5 are discussing the godly soul. We discussed what it is. Right? Chapter 1 was sort of an introduction and to the two souls. We learned a tiny bit about the animal soul. But really, chapter 2 introduced us to the godly soul. We know what it is. We know how it feels. What are the emotions and what are the experiences and what is the knowledge? What is a godly emotion? Godly emotion is love of God or fear of God. Is the want to connect to God, is God, the reverence of God, all of those emotions that we have in a godly way. Chapters 4 and 5 discuss how do you act on that, which is a tremendous part of understanding the godly soul, because what does the godly soul want to do? It wants to be living in chapters 4 and 5. It wants at every second to be doing the mitzvos. It wants at every second to be connecting to God. How does it connect to God? By doing mitzvos, by doing the right thing, and by learning Torah. The problem is, as chapter 6 is going to start, that it has a counterpart. God created everything in balance. And so yes, we have a godly soul, but we also have an animal soul. And starting from chapter 6, we're going to learn about the animal soul. We're going to learn what is it, how does it operate, etc. How it compares to the godly soul. And then we'll discuss the lifelong battle that these two souls are locked in that we call our life. So, at the end of chapter 5, we can hopefully begin to understand our godly side. What makes us tick from a godly perspective? Where is that feeling coming from? Where does it want to go? And what does it want to do, as we discussed in chapters 3, 4, and 5? Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for bearing with me on this slightly esoteric chapter as we discuss the connections that we form with God. And walking away, we all have that connection within us. We have that Torah knowledge within us. And as we move on, God willing, next week, I look forward to seeing you all again, as we do. For those that are going to be here, I'll see you on Shabbos. I'll see you on Sunday or Tuesday for those that are joining the JLI class. And we'll be spending a lot of time building this connection with God, God willing. Thank you very much.